The cabin of Flight 907 to London carried the heavy silence of midnight travel, a silence broken only by the drone of engines and the occasional rustle of someone shifting in their seat. Yet beneath the dim amber lights and recycled air, something was brewing that no one except a few eyes on board could sense, and in row 6, seat B, a woman lay apparently sleeping. Her head tilted against the headrest, her hair falling forward to half conceal her face, her breathing steady but far too light for genuine rest, for though her posture mimicked exhaustion, her senses had been honed by years of training to remain. Half awake even in slumber, always aware, always listening. To most, she was just another anonymous traveler, maybe a businesswoman returning from a conference or a mother heading home, her ticket marked with the unassuming name Claire Donovan. But that name was nothing more than a shell, a thin skin stretched over an identity so dangerous it had been the subject of whispered briefings in both Washington and London, where men in suits debated whether she was an asset too valuable to lose or a liability too volatile to keep alive. And in Moscow, her name was carved onto a list that never ended well for anyone, a list marked for elimination. The passengers around her had no idea they were sharing a cabin with someone whose past could rewrite geopolitics, though if they had been more observant, they might have noticed the small details. The two men near the rear lavatories who were far too alert for the hour, their eyes never lingering on movies or magazines, the subtle way a man in row 22 adjusted his cuff to reveal a scar etched along his jawline, the deliberate pacing of a steward whose smile never reached his eyes. Everything about this flight was calculated, stage-managed from the moment Claire had bought her ticket under false credentials, and the agencies who tracked her every move had been forced into a corner, unable to risk an operation on the ground, preferring the controlled chaos of 30,000 feet where there were no allies, no safe zones, only air, steel, and the certainty that once the plane landed, the web of governments and intelligence would be too slow to catch her again. Claire's past was a mosaic of shadows. Once a field analyst, later a ghost operative for MI6, then a freelancer who had played both sides of wars no one dared to name. She had seen the insides of black sites that technically didn't exist, carried messages across borders where bullets were cheaper than bread, and disappeared into jungles, deserts, and cities alike, always leaving governments scrambling in her wake. And though she had no nation left to call her own, the secrets buried inside her mind were worth more than any warhead. Tonight was supposed to be her quiet passage, her escape to London where a contact promised new papers and a new life, but her instincts, those sharp instruments polished by survival, told her something was wrong the moment she stepped into the jet bridge. The way a man in uniform studied her boarding pass too long, the subtle static in her ear as if a frequency was being jammed, the faint tremor in the air that she could only describe as the prelude to violence. Still, she boarded, sat in row 6, closed her eyes, and let the world believe she was harmless. For she knew that only by appearing weak could she gauge the strength of those sent to hunt her. 3 rows behind, hidden beneath casual jackets and bland expressions, a fire team of Navy SEALs shifted quietly in their seats, each one disguised as an ordinary traveler, but carrying the calm readiness of men who had breached compounds and pulled hostages from war zones. Their orders were clear: secure the woman in row 6 alive, contain her before anyone else on this plane realized who she truly was. But none of them had been told the full truth. None had been briefed on why every intelligence agency in the West feared her, and none of them were prepared for what would happen when they finally closed in. The captain's voice crackled overhead, announcing cruising altitude with a warmth that belied the tension simmering in the aisles, and passengers relaxed, stretching legs, ordering drinks, unaware that a silent clock was already ticking down. To the moment when peace shattered, and Claire, half asleep, half alert, felt it too, the faint vibration beneath her feet, the shift in cabin energy that told her hunters had boarded the same flight. And she wondered, with the calm fatalism of someone who had lived too long in the shadows, whether tonight she would finally stop running or whether the men in the dark uniforms would discover, too late, that not everything was as it seemed. As the engines hummed steadily and the cabin settled into uneasy quiet, Claire felt the shift before it happened. The unnatural silence of trained men rising from their seats, two pretending to stretch while another checked the overhead bin with too much precision. Their every move choreographed, though, meant to appear casual. They were closing in, row by row. Yet before they could reach her, another player emerged. A wiry man in a leather jacket moving down the aisle with predatory intent, his eyes flicking once toward Claire before settling on his jacket pocket where the shape of a weapon bulged, and in that instant she understood the terrible truth. This wasn't a clean capture by the SEALs. This was a convergence, multiple factions hunting her at once, and the moment the man reached for his weapon, the SEALs froze, their cover threatened, their mission unraveling, and Claire, still slouched as if asleep, realized the fight for row 6 had already begun. The moment fractured like glass under pressure. 1 second the plane was a silent trap, the next it was a storm of motion as the man in the leather jacket lunged toward row 6. The SEALs surged from their seats, and Claire's eyes snapped open with a clarity that froze them all. She moved faster than any passenger could comprehend, her hand brushing the hidden disruptor and triggering a silent pulse that killed every earpiece in the cabin, leaving the SEALs suddenly deaf to their commander, their formation crumbling, while the assassin's pistol, half drawn under his jacket, was intercepted by Claire's grip as she twisted his wrist and slammed him against the armrest with a force that made nearby travelers gasp in shock. Chaos rippled through the cabin as frightened passengers ducked. Attendants screamed, and yet through the confusion Claire stood calm, her voice low as she hissed to the stunned SEAL nearest her. "You don't even know why you're here, do you?" And in his eyes, she saw the hesitation of a soldier realizing his mission had been built on lies, a hesitation that widened as more armed figures revealed themselves further down the aisle, neither American nor Russian, but mercenaries. Proof that a third hand was playing this deadly game, and in that instant, everyone on board understood. Row 6 was no longer just a seat. It was the fault line where nations and shadows would collide. The cabin had become a battlefield of silence and fear, though no shots had yet been fired, and every soul aboard felt the tremor of history unfolding around row 6, where Claire now stood fully awake, her expression no longer that of a tired traveler, but of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering chaos, her presence alone radiating the kind of authority that bent men of war into hesitation. The SEALs, trained to breach terrorist compounds, found themselves inexplicably still, their hands hovering but not striking, because the truth was dawning in fragments. Her face, her movements, the way she disarmed the assassin in the leather jacket with clinical precision, it all connected to rumors whispered in dark halls of the Pentagon, to dossiers buried under classification levels so deep most had dismissed them as myth. The assassin crumpled in her grip, snarling threats in Russian, but she silenced him with a strike to the throat that left him gasping, and as she turned back toward the SEAL closest to her, she said quietly, almost wearily, "If you knew who I really was, you wouldn't have boarded this flight." Those words sent ripples of doubt through the team, and in that hesitation, the mercenaries at the far end of the cabin surged forward, their weapons poorly concealed but lethal enough. And the SEALs, forced into instinct, drew their suppressed sidearms, the air vibrating with the impossible tension of a firefight about to erupt in a pressurized tube 30,000 feet above the ocean. Passengers screamed, ducking low, some praying, others frozen, and yet Claire moved with eerie calm, her disruptor still pulsing, jamming comms and leaving every soldier deaf to orders from above. She bent, snatched the fallen assassin's weapon, and leveled it not at the mercenaries nor at the SEALs, but straight toward the ceiling where the oxygen masks were stored, her finger resting lightly on the trigger as she hissed, "You fire in here, and I bring this bird down." That threat was no bluff, and the mercenaries paused, uncertain, calculating the odds, while the SEALs shifted uneasily, realizing they were being manipulated into a standoff they didn't understand. Then came the twist no one aboard could have predicted. From the cockpit, the reinforced door cracked open, and the captain stepped into view, his face pale, his voice trembling as he looked straight at Claire and whispered, "Ma'am, we didn't think you were still alive." The SEALs froze entirely then, because the word ma'am was not casual. It was the tone reserved for someone ranked far above them, someone whose clearance outstripped their commanders, and in that single revelation, the truth uncoiled. Like a serpent. Claire Donovan was no rogue asset, no fugitive, but the architect of programs so classified that even those sent to capture her had never been allowed to see her real file. She had been the ghost who trained ghosts, the strategist who had written doctrines buried under code names, a woman who had once commanded black operations that bent nations into obedience before vanishing into presumed death. The mercenaries faltered, their employers' money suddenly meaningless if it meant firing on someone whose very existence was a state secret, and the SEALs, caught between duty and shock, lowered their weapons slightly, their eyes reflecting the impossible weight of the moment. Claire's gaze swept the cabin, her voice cutting through the panic with cold precision. This plane was never about me escaping. It was about flushing out who wanted me dead, and now you've all shown. Your hands. She let the silence stretch, broken only by the distant hum of engines as the passengers huddled in confusion, and then, with one final motion, she released the disruptor, tossed the pistol onto an empty seat, and sat back down in row 6 as if none of it mattered, her words echoing like a curse. "Tell your governments. The ghost is awake again." The SEALs, stunned and trembling, could do nothing but obey the stillness that her presence demanded, and in that fragile equilibrium the mercenaries retreated. The assassin lay broken, and the cabin slowly began to breathe again. Yet every man, in uniform, knew the truth, that when the wheels touched down in London, the world they had left behind before takeoff would not be the same, because row 6 had become the epicenter of a storm that would soon engulf nations, and the woman who had been sleeping lightly had just awakened into war.